and about as far away from Alaska and a farm in Vermont as one can imagine. Born into high social status in Philadelphia, she was the daughter of a renowned brain surgeon who performed the first brain surgery in the United States. After graduating from Vermont, she was active in philanthropic organizations supporting fair labor laws and children's rights, among other causes. Dora's love of travel and the mountains began in her childhood, with trips to the Adirondacks and White Mountains, and later touring the world with her father to Norway. Excuse me. She also, with her father, climbed mountains in the Dolomites, the Andes, and the Alps. One magazine wrote, where others went to the seaside to dress and dance, she preferred an expedition to the Alps, a horseback trip across Paraguay, or a hunting trip in the wilds of Africa. Dora, who stood only 5 feet tall, began climbing in earnest in the Alps at the age of 39. Over the next 3 years, she climbed 20 peaks, including Mount Blanc, Mount Rosa, and the Matterhorn. She wrote articles on these experiences for the National Geographic and other publications. But it was in 1911 in Alaska where her climbing fame began and was truly attained. I'm going to relate to you the story of her ascent of Mount Blackburn, remembering that she was 40 years old and traveling alone. There's a picture of Mount Blackburn also over there later. She had set out for Alaska to get a look at the last frontier region of America, spending time rough camping and climbing a few 5,000 to 6,000 foot peaks, 1,000-foot peaks. She quickly discovered that the ferocious mosquitoes vanished when climbing above the tree line. Anyone who's gone to Alaska would know mosquitoes. When happening on a prospector's cabin, she saw a report from the U.S. Geological Survey stating Mount Blackburn, the second highest peak in Alaska, had never been climbed and was worthy of the hardiest mountaineer. That was all she needed. In consulting a map, she concluded that she could ride the newly completed Copper River Railway to within 35 miles of Mount Blackburn's base. And again, this is actually one of Dora's maps that is only partially unrolled. And I have marked with an orange marker the railway line up and where Mount Blackburn is there. These maps were still in the basement of the house at the foot, Beulah Farm, at the foot of Andy Road. From there, she would have to cross the Kennecott Glacier, which itself takes several days. The snow line of Alaska comes down to as low as 6,000 feet, which means a climb is much more difficult than in the Alps, where the snow line is quite a bit higher. On Mount Blackburn, this would mean climbing 10,000 feet in the snow. One of the reasons so few of the great peaks of Alaska have never been climbed. I won't go into too much detail of this first attempt, as it was her second when she succeeded. At the head of the railroad, she assembled a group of 7 men, none or even been above 10,000 feet. But all were rugged Alaskan men who knew how to travel in 60 degrees below weather. There was no equipment available, and so Dora had crampons and ice axes made. Nothing stopped Dora. This group made it through avalanches and across crevices with no ropes until the 10th day when a huge storm arrived. They had no choice but to turn back. Excuse me. On the long journey back to Philadelphia, Dora spent her time planning for the return the next year. A quote written by her at this time reads in part, "Exploring this formidable mountain exposed a new world without limitations. A world which I feel as if the bonds that held me to the earth are loosened. Life demands courage." She returned in the spring and again hired 7 men, including George Handy, who had some limited experience in climbing. This time she brought along, more equipment and used dogs to pull the sledge for part of the way. But they had even more trouble with avalanches than before. The old prospectors, who were part of the group, assured Dora, "You can most generally always sidestep them in time after you heard the first crack." Not the best advice. After a few days of climbing in these conditions, avalanches and deep snow, it was decided to make an attempt at the summit in one great rush, instead of going up and down, establishing camps with food and shelter at intervals. The men thought the whole gulch, where they were going up and down, was going to give way at any time. They said, "Just take food and what you have to, and we men can sleep in the sun." Dora was still unconvinced, fearing the storm and having no protection. The men said they would take a chance, rather than pack all that junk up and down again any longer. Dora noted with alarm that the junk referred to as shelter, extra food, and clothing. After making it to 12,400 feet, they dug snow caves for the night and woke the next morning not only cold, but finding a raging blizzard. They were pinned in the snow caves for 3 days when they realized they would have to make a retreat to the camp below. At this point, 2 of the men left, and shortly after, 2 more left, leaving Dora, Andy, and Mr. Lang. 20 feet of snow fell during the next 13 days. We thought we had a lot. Which meant that the 3 had to abandon their tents and thus spent these days in snow caves dug in the snow, chilly and damp. Dora insisted the only thing she minded was not having enough water to brush her teeth. When the storm subsided, the 3 started up again, and after struggling for 2 days, made it to 15,000 feet, where they all began to feel the altitude. Suddenly, Lang dropped everything and rushed past them down, saying he didn't feel well, having only 500 feet more to go. The next morning, George and Dora reached the summit of Mount Blackburn. They reveled in the wide open views of snow and wilderness for 200 miles in every direction. In all, the climb took 33 days, with 22 spent in snow caves. It was the only expedition at this time in Arctic exploration to have been led and organized by a woman. She was met with great acclaim on her return. She wrote articles, gave talks, including the American Alpine Club, where she was joined by 3 other great explorers, Shackleton, Stephenson, and Perry. At the age of 41 and 5 feet tall, it was written that she made quite a contrast. In 1914, she returned to Alaska at the urging of the National Geographic Society to study the Hartford Glacier and a range of mountains near there, since named the Dora Range. In 1916, Dora returned once more to Alaska for quite a different reason. Her sister accompanied her for her wedding to George Handy, who, as you remember, had been with her on her ascent of Mount Blackburn. And there's a picture of them on there over there at the wedding. They were married in a little mining town within sight of Mount Blackburn, and then set off for 2 months of wilderness camping. On the return, they came to Vermont, where they bought a farm on Handy Road, which they actively farmed for 16 years. One picture is of a field of potatoes, which they had sheep, who knows what. George and Dora were divorced at the end of 16 years, with Dora remaining on the farm. This was her base for the rest of her life. Once at almost 60, a new chapter in her life began. Selling life insurance. And, of course, traveling. She also worked for a time as the librarian in the West Hartford Library. There's also a picture of her standing in front of the library. From speaking with older residents in town and the Hartford Historical Society, I've heard tales of her eccentricities and also just how forceful a saleswoman she could be. I'm sure there are stories, I know there are after. Her travels during these years took her to South America, Australia, New Guinea, Kenya, and Java. At the age of 91, she began a tour around the world, beginning in Alaska, on to Tokyo, and then Hong Kong. Dora died in Hong Kong, ending her days doing what she wished, on an adventure. So my thoughts of Handy Road being a shortcut was wrong by many lengthy returns. But the story of Dora has taken me on a bit of an adventure also. I think Lori now will deal with some stories people have to tell, etc.
I thought first I would speak on how I first heard of Dora being handy. When I was a little kid, I was with my mother in her car, and she was coming up the hill in West Hartford, having crossed the bridge. And I had a rabbit at the time, and I noticed in this field there was all this clover. So I asked my mother if she'd stop the car. I had a container, and I went out and I collected some of the clover for the rabbit. And walking back to the car, I noticed this big, white, beautiful house. And I asked her, who lives there? And my mother said, Dora King Handy. And that was the first time I ever heard of her spoken of. And later, quite a few years later, my brother and his wife bought her home. And they lived there for 25 years. And of course, they were quite interested in who she was. And so when I started thinking about this program, I thought the first thing probably would be to mention her mother. Her mother was a Borden from Fall River, Massachusetts. And apparently her mother had grown up with money. And so there's no indication that her mother had a job. She was probably what you call a society lady. And she was a member of the Philadelphia Main Line. And her father, I thought, was extremely interesting because he was the first brain surgeon in the United States. And he was even active at the end of the Civil War. He was at Bull Run, and he was a doctor there treating the wounded soldiers. And one of the famous people that he operated on was President Grover Cleveland, who was thought to have cancer in the jaw. And the president was, in these days, these presidential illnesses were all top secret. And he was operated on a ship called the Oneida. It was moored in New York Harbor. And Dr. Keene wasn't the only doctor, but he was one of the main doctors operating on the president. And he had, I've got some other information on him over here. Another very interesting thing, it involved President Franklin Roosevelt, up on Cantebello Island, I think it was something about 1916, the president had gone in the ocean with his children, and coming out, his lower legs were numb. And he got up the house, and the next day he was much worse off. And Dr. Keene happened to be on a neighboring island, so he was called in. And he prescribed some form of physical therapy, which was not successful, and it was apparently not the right road to get on. And it wasn't until the Roosevelts got back to New York City that the president was then correctly, he was correctly diagnosed with polio. But by that time, the paralysis was permanent. And it's kind of interesting, the Second World War, I suppose it was supposed to pretty much hidden that he actually was crippled. So anyway, he had a distinguished education, studied at Brown University, graduated in 1859. So you see, he would have been old enough ultimately to have actually been someone active medically in the Civil War. Interestingly enough, it just mentions two children here, and this is the Wikipedia story on him. But as this lady has indicated, she had a sister. And I think over here that, let me see. He had many honors. He honorary degrees from Jefferson Medical College in Brown, Northwestern, Toronto, Edinburgh, Yale, St. Andrews, and several others. He's president of the American Surgical Association, the American Medical Association, the Congress of American Physicians and Surgeons, the American Philosophical Society, and he also received several honors when he was in England. Honorary Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, the Royal Surgeons of Edinburgh, and various others. Several procedures were named for him. One was called Keene's Operation, and another Keene's Sign, increasing the diameter of the leg at the malleol, and Pott's fracture of the fibula. He published quite a few things. Clinical charts on the human body, early history of practical anatomy, surgical complications and sequels of typhoid fever, American animal experimentation and medical progress, and American textbook of surgery, Keene's system of surgery, and also he must have used this during the Civil War because he also co-authored gunshot wounds and other injuries of nerves. And to speak of Dora, I think she had actually quite an impressive education. She graduated from Bryn Mawr in 1896, and as Judy indicated, she had various positions with philanthropic organizations in Philadelphia, including the Society to Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the American Society for Labor Legislation, and Society of Organizing Charity, helping to bring about important reforms. And Judy did a wonderful job explaining for alpine climbing, which of course was what made her so well known. And as Judy indicated, she was married to George Handy, and I'm under the impression, I may be mistaken, but I don't think so, that it was a marriage where she came from the high echelon of society, and his background was pretty modest. And I had a sixth grade teacher, Grace Brulette, in Wilder, and she was also the principal. And then in her old age, she told me about both Dora and George, and she said they were very mismatched in that their backgrounds were so different. And she was, Mrs. Brulette lived right next to what they call the Wilder School. When I was here, it was the Wilder Grammar School. And she said he didn't even know how to handle his silverware properly. So she thought he was not much of a catch. Anyway, one of the quotes that Judy mentioned earlier, as I remember you told me when we met at the library, life demands courage and creativity. That sound right to you? And anyway, over here, part of this book, it's pertaining to FDR, the man he became, how FDR defied polio to win the presidency. And there's a section here on Dr. King and what had happened and the misdiagnosis. As I indicated earlier, my brother and his wife bought the house, the Dora King Handy house from Carl Johnson, who was my mechanical drawing teacher when I was in high school, a senior in high school. And an interesting gentleman, because prior to that time, he had worked for the Arabian American Oil Company over in Saudi Arabia. And and Carl and his wife, they bought it from Dora's estate. And then my brother and his wife bought it in 1973. And here, I've got a picture, in fact, Judy has it here as well. It shows the farm. Let me see here. Yeah, this here, Beulah Farm. And this was a ad for its sale. Unfortunately, it's not dated. But one of the things that caught my eye was with it came livestock, including 200 sheep. And in front of the house here, you see the sheep. And one of the things, George Brockway, who was years ago, he was the Windsor County clerk. And when he was a boy, as you go up that hill past the big white house, you keep going, and up towards Queechee, if you look to your far right, there's a big farmhouse up there. And George, that's where he grew up. And he walked from that location all the way down to West Hartford to go to school. And then he walked all the way back. But he told the story of one day he was walking by the farm on his way home after school. And he said that there was a hired man, and he was baling hay, and one hand got caught in the hay baler. And he lost part of that hand out of that tragic accident. So here, I have these pictures here. This shows part of Mount Blackburn. And I think this, didn't you say, Judy, this is a glacier?
Yeah.
So this shows the glacier, and I guess walking across that was probably quite a hike in itself, wouldn't it be?
7 days, it's a...
Yeah. And this is another scene. It shows it, of course, in the distance. This is some body of water, obviously. Anyway, when my brother and his wife bought the house, this is how it looked like. And they did a lot of work on that house. And this is the house as it looks today, right here. And these are interior shots of the house. Now, the interior would look a lot different because they updated it, particularly the kitchen. And, but anyway, in any event, it does show the interior of the house. And there was, oh, another thing is the property, as Judy knows, and it abuts your property, the Appalachian Trail. And right down next to the house, it would be the south end, there's this sign which says Appalachian Trail, and you can see the trail as well. And the final thing I was going to mention, I was going to read this paragraph too. Dora never lost her zest for travel and exploration. In her 80s, when the Vermont winters became too much, she toured the Congo, South Africa, Australia, New Guinea, Kenya, Java. She tried Florida, but she gave it up, she explained, because it was just filled with old people. At the age of 91, she embarked on yet another world tour. She flew to Anchorage, Alaska, and continued on to Tokyo and then Hong Kong. She collapsed in her hotel room there and died on January 31, 1963. Her letter home from her final trip ended, "I thirst for adventure." And that she sure did. And the final thing, I have it here somewhere, is relative to one of her trips, obviously before her good death, and I had it here somewhere. Let's see. Oh, here it is right here. Years ago, the Vermont State Library, they put everything on microfilm. And the papers, literally the paper, would be bundled up, each town's paper. And I was up in East Rygate one time, and there was a fellow up there who had bought some of these papers. And I was really looking for the Newport, Vermont Express, and he didn't have what I wanted. But I noticed he had a set of the Informer of White River Junction, which was created in 1930 by a fellow by the name of Greeno Filosa. And if any of you know where Judge Greeno lived, on Halfpenny Road in Wilder, if you're standing in front of Judge Greeno's home, the house to the very left was where Greeno Filosa lived. And I asked him how much he wanted for those papers. And they started in 1930, and he passed away in '59. And shortly after he passed away, the paper folded. And one of them, so I used to keep a $50 bill in my wallet, and I asked the guy, I said, well, what do you want for these papers? He said, I want $50. So that's where my $50 went. And I've looked through many of them, and when you're this old newspaper, you have to be so careful because it can literally fall apart in your hands. But one thing I found a number of things, but one thing pertained to Dora King Handy, and it was, the date was 1950, and it is headlined, Tour to Fiji Islands. Mrs. Dora K. Handy of West Hartford recently made arrangements through the Dartmouth Travel Bureau to fly from New York City to San Francisco, where she will embark on a 4-month tour of the Fiji Islands, from there to Rotanga, one of the Cook Islands, Auckland, New Zealand, and Sydney, Australia. She will return to this country sometime the 1st of June. Mrs. Handy has traveled all over the world. She is 78 years old. So that pretty much covers it.
I think some people have stories.
Oh, yes. Alex, you said you were gonna hide in the back. Tell your little story.
Well, I really don't have any little story, but just as I was getting ready to leave tonight, my brother called, and I told him where I was going, and he said, you know, she was a very short, strange little lady. And she would. I mean, I've known this woman to pull up in the road. If there was some glass, she'd stop her car right there and get out, clean up the glass. I mean, you might be in the grocery store. She'd come up to my mother and she'd say, if I buy this potato, will you take half of it? You never knew what Dora was going to. And it was nice in her younger age that she liked children because she was kind of.
I thought you said she scared you.
She did at the library. You went in, you got your book or your books, and you got out of there.
There was another story. My mother had an experience with her. We're associated with the Black family living in Wilder, but in 1944, my mother and father bought a house at 23 Mountain Avenue in Woodstock, right next to the old Faulkner Mansion, if you're aware of it. And anyway, they lived there from 1944 to 48 when they moved to Wilder. And my mother got a phone call from Dora one day, and it was in 1948. And she said to my mother, have you decided who you're going to vote for in the Republican primary for U.S. Senator? And my mother said, no, I haven't. Well, she said, I'll be up to talk to you about it. And my mother was one vote. And she drove from West Hartford all the way to Woodstock to discuss her one vote. And actually, I think the two candidates were Senator Ralph Flanders, who was the incumbent, and he is very famous for having introduced the resolution in the United States Senate to censor Joe McCarthy. And that was one of those censors that should have come a lot earlier, I guess. But anyway, and the other candidate was Sterry Waterman of St. John's, where he later became a federal judge. And for those of you who are older, there was a time in Vermont when we had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Younger people wouldn't believe that today, but there was. There was the conservative wing and the Aiken-Gibson wing. And Gibson was Judge Ernest Gibson, who'd been governor, and his father had been U.S. Senator. And my father first practiced law with Sterry Waterman in St. Johnsburg. So I think Mother voted for Sterry Waterman. So that's about it, I guess.
Did anyone else?
Oh, anyone else? Thank you.
I have a story. And you can be the judge. I lived in the White House. Carl Johnson, as Roy said, Carl Johnson bought it from the Dora King Handy estate. And in 1970, we were coming back from Terre Haute, Indiana. My husband had just received his master's degree at Indiana State University, and we didn't have a place to stay. So Carl asked if we would like to live in the house and act as house parents to his two daughters. So we said, sure. Well, we had a baby. I think my daughter might have been about 9 months old. And one day, my husband taught at Hartford High School. The two girls were at school, and the only other person in the house with me was my child, and she was upstairs in her crib on the second floor taking a nap. So I decided to mop the floor. It was a wooden floor, and I'm mopping the floor, and after a while I went, phew, and I kind of stood back and kind of rested on the mat, on the handle of the mop, and all of a sudden I felt like that on my shoulder. It was the spookiest thing, like somebody took their finger and really hard poked my shoulder 3 times. Now, who was it? You can imagine, yeah. And then another story that Carl Johnson had mentioned was, well, it was mentioned earlier that Dora sold insurance, and there was a doctor like a general practitioner in White River Junction, and I'm sorry, I don't remember what his name was, but Carl told us his story that Dora was quite elderly, and she shows up at the doctor's office and she said, I need to see the doctor. So the secretary or nurse or whoever the person was at the front desk figured, well, gee, at her age, if she needed to see the doctor, then there must be something fairly important. So the other patients were kind of shoved aside, and she went marching into the doctor's office to try to sell him some insurance.
Don Jones used to have some stories about buying insurance from Dora Family.
There's another lady right here.
Well, I'm Patty Talbot, and in 1963, I was newly married to David Talbot, and he was a graduate student at Dartmouth, and there was an ad for an estate sale, and it was at the Handy House, and it was Mr. Handy, who had come to settle his late wife's estate. So we met Mr. Handy, and we admired several things, and he liked us because we were young and newly married, and so he made the prices such that we could afford the things that we wanted to get mostly, except something that he was holding back and he eventually sold to us as for a higher price. But we bought a hand-carved black walnut, big headboarded bed that had been made as a wedding present for Dora Keene's parents, apparently. And he made us promise that we wouldn't sell it to an antiques dealer and that we would sleep in it, and we did. And we had it all those years until we had a fire 11 years ago and we lost everything. But that was our bed. And Mr. Handy also sold us a Trans-Caucasian tent hanging, which was sort of a beautiful, dyed with natural dyes, hand-woven rug of all different beautiful colors, which we didn't walk on. It wasn't that kind of a rug. And an Indian milk pitcher, which she explained would, you poured, the Indian vendor of the milk would hold a cup way down and hold the pitcher way up and make a big display of pouring the milk and selling the cup's worth of milk to a person on the street. And then the thing he didn't want to sell to us right away, but eventually did, was a raccoon skin rug, which he was taking his naps on and he didn't want to give it up. Finally, he sold it to us for the same price as the hand-carved walnut bed.
Do you remember what year that was?
63.
When she died?
He had come to settle the estate, and the books went to Bryn Mawr. And we bought a china cover too, actually, from him.
Anybody else?
Where did George go after?
No, go ahead.
No.
I have a couple stories that I will relate. I'm particularly interested in how the interaction of natives and newcomers during gentrification. And Dora Keene Handy certainly was part of that. So my information comes from two sources mainly, one being my father, Erwin Clifford, and the other one being Hazen Savage.
Look for it on the App Store.
Hazen Savage's father worked for the Handys. And so he had a lot of stories there. And as far as Roy's story about someone losing an arm, that was Alice Hazen's uncle, who lost his arm in an accident there.
An accident. It wasn't in a trailer.
No, that's right.
It was in a sawmill.
Something. Okay, well, there's different stories as far as what it was. But my father told the story about Dora coming down and always trying to sell him insurance. Of course, he's in the car business there, and he doesn't want to bullshit with people unless he's going to make money off them. So, anyways, she comes in one day, and she hit him just right, and she wanted to know if he wanted to buy insurance. He said no, but he says, "I'll buy your field across from the brick house. If you want to sell it, I'll buy it for you." She thought. She said, "Okay, all right." Well, he took paper and they made an agreement and he gave her a down payment. Well, the next morning he gets a phone call. "Mr. Clifford, I've changed my mind." My father said, "I haven't." He ended up in the field. But there was another thing here that Oh, also about the Handys coming up to West Hartford. Hazen's, of course, you know, it's interesting the exaggerations and the stories that get told. When the Handys came up, some people thought that, you know, George Handy was because it was during the war, a German spy. They're the West Hartford, you know. But there's a story that Keene, Dr. Keene was not happy about his daughter marrying George Handy. And that the purchase of the farm up there, he actually financed the purchase of the farm to get them away, to get Handy out of Philadelphia society and get him up here, out of the way. And what his hope was that they could be farm there and be self-sustaining, which I guess they never were, really. And Hazen Savage told one time that his father, they had to hurry and scurry around there because Dr. Keene was coming up to visit. And they had, you know, had this harvest of oats. Well, you know, they might have got 10 bushel or something. Well, they had these oat bins and they filled them up with sawdust and then they poured the oats over And Mr. Keene came and said, well, I see you've had a good harvest of oats. And so, anyways, it could go on, but I just thought I'd throw those out there.
Your name, sir?
Karen, wasn't that farm originally a 500-acre farm?
I don't know.
I was under that impression, the original farm.
Well, who lives in the Handy house now?
The retired CEO of Alice Peck Day Hospital, Harry Dornan, he and his wife.
Oh,
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because when my brother and his wife put that on the market, there were some of these Quechua people that came down and several people really liked it, but they said, well, there's a problem. And so Harry said, well, what's your problem? He said, well, it's too far from Quechua. Yes, she was cremated, and cremated in her ashes, I guess somewhere around, in some type of a garden, wasn't it, in Hong Kong, or an outlying area. Yeah.
did she travel alone, or did she have
Yes, apparently she traveled, didn't she travel more with her father when she was younger?
Young. You can imagine starting off with in those days. Especially in those days.
So where did George go after
He went to New Hampshire.
no, southern New Hampshire? But the Handy Road is named for them, or?
Yes.
What was it called before?
Huh?
What's that road called before?
On Andy Road.
On Handy Road.
Probably wasn't much of a road.
It's not, it's probably,
Like the pad?
All the way through.
yeah.
Well, we have some lovely refreshments. Are there any other comments or any other stories that anybody wanted to tell or questions that you wanted to ask? If not, we have some lovely refreshments here and we would love to
And do
have
come look at the pictures.
you. And